Let me start. I'm Kevin Watkins. I'm director here at ODI. I'm not going to start off by introducing the panel. I'm going to hand over to Paul to do that. But I wanted to welcome all of you here. The immediate backdrop to this event is obviously the tragic outcomes that we've seen in the southern Mediterranean over the last couple of weeks. 1,500 deaths in the space of a single week, and that's clearly a tragedy of epic proportions. But the crisis in the Mediterranean, in a sense, is a symptom of something very much deeper that poses far wider development challenges. And I think ultimately we're dealing at a core with a failure of regional and multilateral systems to respond to the emerging realities of our global interdependence, in particularly for those of us who are living in a in a very rich part of the world, in a relatively secure part of the world that backs on to regions that are desperately poor, in many cases violent and insecure. And one of the realities of that independence is the simple fact that people in an interdependent economy will move. They will move to find security. They will move to escape violence and political persecution. And they will move because of aspirations for a better life and for opportunities. There's actually nothing new in this. We're prone to moral panics about these issues in development. But if you look back in the long sweep of history, the period between the early years of the 1880s and 1914 saw this massive migration of people from the old world into the new world, which was actually one of the great equalizing moments in history that brought down disparities in income, that expanded wealth, that boosted growth, that generated innovation. And the difference between that period and and today's world is that restricting movement on the part of governments in the rich world is the overwhelming priority, that through a set of policies that are holding back development and opportunity in many of the world's poorest countries. And I think in some respects we have to hold our hands up as a development community and say, we haven't really addressed this issue with the urgency and the seriousness that it demands. We've often looked at it in a very segmented way, as a refugee problem, as an asylum problem, as a trade problem, as a migration problem. But actually the crisis in the Mediterranean, in a sense, is a symptom of something that brings all of these different strands together. And I think our failure to engage in the way that we might have done has led to some very unhelpful policy debates in this country and elsewhere in Europe, and to some very misplaced policy approaches. Consider first some of the humanitarian issues associated with the immediate tragedy in the Mediterranean. Those of you with an interest in behavioural economics will recall that David Kanahan was awarded a Nobel Prize for his work with Amos Tversky on risk. And based on over a decade of extensive empirical research, the layperson's conclusion to emerge from this is that actually people are not great at processing risk. Even when they're fully armed with all of the data and all of the information, they tend to make the wrong judgment calls. And he actually tested this out, principally with Harvard maths graduates who got it wrong on most cases. So that is a Nobel Prize winning economist collecting evidence to demonstrate that people don't understand risk. What we have in the debate on the southern Mediterranean are senior political figures in this country and elsewhere on the basis of no evidence at all, assuming that people, before they make the trip from Libya or their countries of departure, are carefully weighing up all of the risks. And if you slightly increase the risk of them drowning, sort of deterrence by drowning, they will reflect in the Bekaa Valley, in Eritrean refugee camps in Ethiopia and elsewhere, that maybe on balance this isn't a smart move to make, completely ignoring the political persecution, the poverty that many people are attempting to escape. So I think politicians making ill-informed remarks and policy judgments is clearly a central part of the crisis that we're dealing with. And I think if you look at the profile of people who are making the journey from Libya, it really tells you something about the complexity of the challenge, because the single biggest group are drawn from the Syrian refugee community in neighbouring countries, over 4 million people. I had an opportunity last year to spend some time interviewing people in the Bekaa Valley. And it's really extraordinary. These are people without a prospect of getting their kids into school, increasing child labour, no healthcare system, no right to work. And this is partly because of the failure of the international community to step up and provide opportunity. You know, we're much better at keeping people out, or attempting to keep people out, than addressing in a constructive way the problems faced by refugees at source. Asylum seekers, you know, is a huge group of people who are attempting to make the crossing, Eritreans in particular. And I think also the core issue that we refuse to face up to is the labour market part of this. You know, it's right and proper that in an unequal world, people will seek opportunities to move. And trying to close the shutters is actually bad for the source country, it's bad for the individuals, but it's also bad for the host countries. You know, we're an aging population that desperately need younger people for the workforce. And the ultimate problem, of course, is that whereas policymakers in Europe would like everybody to line up in a neat queue, marked refugee, asylum seeker, labour market entrant, this is not the reality of the circumstances that are there to be dealt with. So it's a huge privilege, actually, to have a group of speakers here who I think are incredibly well placed to guide us through some of these debates. And Paul, for you to hand over to you as someone who's done an extraordinary amount through your documentaries to really bring across the human face of what's at stake here. So thank you.
No, well, thank you. Thanks for that, Kevin. That was so all-encompassing. I've got nothing left to say, really. I mean, it's...
We're all thinking about it.
Yeah, no, fantastic. That was really good. And thanks to everybody for coming along today, and for all those people that are joining us. We've got a global audience, I'm told, watching on the internet, so that's great, from lots of other countries, some of which will be source countries, I'm sure. I don't know if any of you saw, when you came in, there were some images of a film I made a few years ago, and it was about migration. It was about the migration route, which I call the most dangerous migration route in the world, out of Africa and into Europe. And we're all fully used to seeing the images of the boats going down in the Mediterranean. And I just thought, whilst you were coming in, you should see the other side of it, because not many people talk about the desert, the first leg of the journey, the fact that these people have already been through so much by the time they get to the coast of Libya. Which chimes in with what Kevin's saying, the idea that after a journey of that length with that much risk, the idea that David Cameron or any other politician could say, you know, now start weighing up the risk. They've already taken the risk. By the time they get to the coast, they ain't going to be turning back. You know, they feel as though they're nearly there. They can smell it. They're in reach of it. So some of those, if you didn't see it, some of the pictures were really upsetting. We found dead bodies strewn around, quite often young lads with just a water bottle, empty water bottles in their hands. And these were, 18, 19, 20-year-olds who'd been told, and I know because I've spoken to some of those before they took the journey, they'd been told, if you carry on walking, you should be able to walk across the Sahara in a day, just take a bottle of water, should be fine. And these are some of the people who'd be taking money off them just to give directions and a little bit of a ride in a Land Rover, a Jeep or something, and then see them disappear off over the horizon and know they were never going to come back and to complain. We all know there's been an extraordinarily high number of deaths already, though, this year in the Mediterranean. I mean, it was record numbers, I think, by the time we got to March. Alex will know more about that. But it's a very, very complex issue, which is why we've got this panel together to talk about it. One of the things about the diverse backgrounds, there's a mix of people there. It's very difficult to extract who's who, to find out what their backgrounds are. It takes months when they get into Europe to discover exactly what their provenance is, what kind of skills they got, whether they're, economic migrants or whatever. And obviously, sometimes the line is incredibly blurred. An economic migrant can also have reasons to apply for asylum because they're also fleeing something they believe is a real threat back in their home country. So, to extract the diversity of different migrants that are coming in, across the Mediterranean route is something we will look at tonight. Also, Libya. I spent quite a bit of time in Libya, but Lawrence here spent a huge amount of time in Libya, and we'll come to him in a minute. But, you know, it's a broken state now. It's extremely difficult for us to say, look, Libya has to sort that out. We know there are two governments there at the moment. I mean, who do you talk to? You know, what semblance of organisation is there? Are they really doing patrols, certainly on their southern border to stop people coming in? And who are the people smugglers or the people traffickers? Because when I was there, a lot of the people traffickers were... they were Libyan officials. So again, when David Cameron says we just need to sort out, you know, target the traffickers are quite often Libyan officials. Very, very difficult to target them. Right, so I'm going to introduce you to the panel. And what's going to happen is that they're going to give you about 5 minutes each. I'll ask a sort of big, broad question. We'll go through them one by one, and then at the end, we'll open it up to the floor, if that's all right. And please do follow the event on Twitter. Hashtag migrant crisis using handle, I'm not sure what a handle is, to be honest, but handle at ODI Dev. Right, first of all, let me introduce Lawrence Hart, head of the Migrant Assistance Division at the IOM in Geneva. Lawrence was formerly IOM's Chief of Mission in Tunis from 2003 to 2006, and in Tripoli in Libya from 2006 to 2011, when he was also acting humanitarian coordinator for Libya with the UN. And I know Lawrence because my recollection is he had the most reliable supply of wine in the whole of Tripoli. He had quite a lot of friends there, didn't you? Coming around every night. So Lawrence, why has Libya become the gateway to Europe over its North African neighbours? Could we have seen this coming? And what should our priority be in bringing the situation under control?
Thank you, Paul, and thanks to ODI for organizing this event, which is very timely. I guess the situation is one that has been ongoing now for many years, even before the crisis. I mean, you were in Libya in times when there was no broken state, or it was already a broken state, but with another situation. And shipwrecks did occur at the time. Libya was used as a platform for many migrants and asylum seekers to go to Europe. But why Libya and not other countries instead, neighboring countries, was used as a transit country? Mainly because Libya was seen as a great opportunity for many migrant workers, initially from African countries, neighboring African countries, but also other West African countries and East African countries. But increasingly over time, by many Asian migrant workers who were coming to work in Libya for very specific construction projects, infrastructure, hotels, etc., because the Libyans, as many Europeans now, do not engage any longer in manual work. So the Libyans needed this strong force, strong numbers of migrant workers. So for them it was a great opportunity. And for some of them was a destination country, or somewhat a temporary destination country. So they saw Libya just as a point of seasonal work, especially for neighboring countries. But some of them ended up trafficked or ended up in a way exploited, and the appetite to move away from those conditions of exploitation was, of course, got bigger because Europe was just a stone throw away to Lampedusa being the first port of entry for Europe. So I would say that everything has changed in Libya nowadays, but nothing has changed because, as I was saying before, we had this situation that is continuing. Probably what we see now compared to the years, the previous years, is that there's more violence and there's more trafficking and exploitation, but that did exist already beforehand. Why is it also a point of entry, and why has it become so attractive? Is because there was always, and still is, there is a limited capacity to control very porous and extensive borders, desert borders, which remain also very difficult to control, and enables them to come in and go out for many migrants. I guess that one of the issues is nowadays we are faced with is what can we do about it? I mean, this is lengthy debates, and you've seen surely some recommendation coming out of European Union. I won't discuss this because there's going to be someone else that will comment on that. But one thing that I would like to bring to the attention is that we have the tendency of seeing Libya as a failed state. Nothing can be done there, which is true to a certain extent. It's in a very, very precarious situation. But we should not forget that there is a core number of people in Libya who are willing to make the difference and bring about change. So we have to, and I think it's a moral imperative, to look at how we leverage with these people in order to provide the necessary assistance. Just to give you a couple of anecdotes, I think last week we came to know that the Libyan Coast Guard actually engaged in search and rescue operation. Nothing that hit the news, but a limited capacity is there. So how do we manage to strengthen this capacity of Libyan entities to actually help the migrants being rescued? And finally...
And can I butt in? No,
yeah,
you'll
sure.
hear the finally in a minute. But, one of the problems was, I remember that Gaddafi could turn the tap on and off, couldn't he, when it came, came to migration flows. Actually, they were patrolling the coast pretty forcefully, weren't they? One of the problems was, of course, that, it became a political issue, so that if he fell out with Europe over anything, he would open the tap and more migrants would come, and you may know this. And at other times when he's getting on well with us, or he had a good oil deal or whatever, he'd close the tap off and we'd say, my goodness, he's very good at dealing with migration. But one of the problems is that, that once the Libyans capture people at sea and bring them back, particularly now, there's a very, very uncertain fate for them. And there always has been. What do they do when they get them back there?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And this is exactly what I was going to...
Oh, sorry.
No, it's good. But it's a good question because it emphasizes. There was recently a EU-led dialogue with the Libyan mayors, Libyan municipalities in Brussels. And it was quite evident that the majority of these mayors, especially in the northwestern coast of Libya, where the boats depart from, so I can mention some names like Zuara, Sabrata, Zawiya, some of you may be knowledgeable about these names. They are crying for help and assistance. They are asking, how can you help us manage these migration flows in terms of also how do we cater assistance, how do we screen them, what kind of solutions can we find for them? And I think this is extremely important because we should not leave these people alone, because for them it's also a public order problem that they're experiencing, because a lot of youth are unemployed, and so the shortcut, the easy way, is to engage in smuggling and trafficking for the Libyan youth. So how can we find ways to productively employ these people, not in situations which are of exploitation and trafficking? So this in a very, very quick nutshell, the answer to your questions. I just wanted to quickly, I brought a few slides, allow me just to go very quickly through them. This is a picture, and I would like, this resonates very, very differently. I think what was said about the news about migrants arriving, how does this resonate in the UK, for example, for people sitting in a living room in Clacton or other cities? They might say, oh God, another load of migrants. The more humanitarian people, even in the UK, might say, oh God, these need help and support. But what does it say in Dakar? What does it say in the capital of Eritrea? They made it. Let's go. These are people, look, they're cheering, they arrived. So this is actually something that the narrative can change a lot. This is just a slide about a project that we've been carrying out about counting the deaths of migrants, and it shows a little bit where the major crises are taking place and how many deaths we're seeing. And this was a little bit the main routes, to unpack a little bit the complexity of the main routes for migrants, how they arrive into Libya, how do they arrive in North Africa, and how they set off then to the to European shores. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Cheers for that. Thanks, Lawrence. Next, we've got Alexander Betts, who's Director of the Refugee Study Centre and Associate Professor in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies. And we're lucky to have him here at all because he seems to spend most of his time on the television at the moment, doing interviews about this. So, you've been quoted in the media a lot recently, stating that Mediterranean smugglers aren't actually the problem. So what is, and what do you propose is the solution?
I
think one of the things that I've found most disappointing over the last 10 days is the way in which European governments and the European Union have mischaracterized the nature of the issue. We saw from the start of last week an attempt to characterize the issue as about trafficking by Matteo Renzi and Philip Hammond. They then realized that, of course, this had nothing to do with trafficking, so the language shifted more towards smuggling, and we've ended up with a war on smuggling. Now, of course, smugglers are involved in the issue. Smugglers are a way in which people are exploited and spend huge amounts of money travelling from situations with immense vulnerability to the Mediterranean and across the Mediterranean. But smugglers are not the underlying cause of the issue. And to assume this is about smugglers is to willfully mischaracterise the problem. And it's led somehow to a situation where, by the end of last week, a human tragedy had been transformed into a way to further reinforce border control and migration management. Smugglers respond to an underlying demand for migration. They don't create migration. And an attempt to dismantle smuggling networks might make European politicians feel a lot better, but it's not going to do anything to dissuade desperate and vulnerable people from attempting to cross the Mediterranean. What it will do is change a little bit the price of crossing the Mediterranean, make the journey more dangerous, and to use an analogy, it will be similar to the response we've had on the so-called war on drugs. A war on smuggling will change demand and supply dynamics and price dynamics, but it will fail to address the underlying issue. The response we saw in terms of the 10-point plan from the meeting in Luxembourg, the response we saw in Brussels was all about immigration control and appeasing electorates across Europe and had nothing to do with the underlying causes. To give you a couple of examples that I found faintly ridiculous from the response, David Cameron pledged to commit the Navy to the Mediterranean to do a little bit of search and rescue, but he, of course, had to highlight that we wouldn't take any of those asylum seekers into the UK, we'd just hand them back over to the Italians. The French went to the UN Security Council and briefly tried to get a resolution to see this as an international security issue and attack smugglers on the territory of Libya and in the Mediterranean. Of course, Ban Ki-moon highlighted that that was ridiculous. So what is this really about? This isn't so much a migrant crisis as a refugee emergency. When we look at who's actually crossing the Mediterranean, an increasing proportion are coming from refugee-producing countries. Yes, they are mixed flows. Yes, many are still coming from countries like Mali and Senegal, fleeing because of poverty or seeking to improve their lives. But a significant proportion, and a growing proportion, are from Syria, Eritrea, Somalia. They are highly likely to be refugees, and we have an absolute obligation under international law and human rights law to protect them, allow them access to our territory, and allow them to seek asylum. And indeed, while we may not have similar obligations to people who we doubt are refugees, we have an obligation to allow them to seek asylum by getting access to territory and have that opportunity. And we've seen a complete dereliction of that responsibility. If we want to understand the causes of this tragedy, we need to see it in a much broader context. First of all, people were dying in the Mediterranean because of the failure of the European Union to provide adequate search and rescue. The abolition of Mare Nostrum in November 2014 is why more and more people are dying. It saved around 100,000 lives last year. The attempt to triple the budget of Operation Triton last week is simply not good enough. It won't resolve the problem. By the admission of the EU's border agency Frontex, Triton is about border security. It's not about search and rescue. The second main underlying cause of this, though, is around the world we have a global displacement crisis. More people are displaced than at any time since the Second World War. Over 50 million people, 16 million of whom are refugees. And if we go to Syria, the population that is the most significant number of those crossing the Mediterranean, we've got 10 million displaced Syrians, 4 million of whom are refugees. Now, most of those are in the region that they come from. Most are in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. The capacity of those countries to continue to host refugees is declining. Lebanon and Jordan have closed their borders. These people have got to go somewhere. And of course, more and more are crossing the Mediterranean because they cannot get effective protection in the region, they cannot get access to territory, and they have to seek protection somewhere. That's the reason why we see the crisis on the scale we do today. and those proportions of people are changing. So the question is, what can we do about that? Is it the case that we can't do anything? No, I don't think it is, but we've got to see the real causes in order to resolve them. How can we engage with, say, the Syrian refugee crisis meaningfully? How can we make that part of a solution? Well, we've got to recognise that the degree of responsibility that Europe is taking for that crisis is infinitesimally small in proportion to, say, the countries in the Middle East and on the border with Syria. The number of people we've committed to resettle in the UK is a matter of a couple of hundred. The number of people who have arrived as spontaneous arrival asylum seekers from Syria is just a few hundred. Compare that with 1.6 million in Turkey, 800,000 in Jordan, and a quarter of the Lebanon population, including half of Lebanon's school-age population. So we need to resettle a lot more. We need to continue to support refugees in the countries that they come from, but recognise that it's unfair to assume responsibility for refugees lies in the regions of origin. It's a global, shared and collective responsibility. This week is the 40th anniversary of the evacuation of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War. After the Vietnam War, we had literally millions of Vietnamese and Indo-Chinese boat people who crossed territorial waters in the 1970s and 80s. They sought asylum in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, the Philippines, Hong Kong. Those countries initially pushed the boats back into the water. But what happened is there was moral outrage as we saw people drowning and dying on television and in newspapers. And so the United Nations High Commission for Refugees showed incredible leadership, and in 1989 a comprehensive plan of action was convened based on global international cooperation. The deal that was done is that those countries agreed not to continue to push boats back into the water in exchange for countries like the US, Canada, European countries, Australia, New Zealand, resettling all those who were genuine refugees, and those that were judged not to be could be returned to countries that they come from in a humane way, and alternative legal channels for migration were opened up. It wasn't easy, it required political leadership, but there are analogies between that situation involving boat people and the present day in the Mediterranean. We need serious political leadership, and I think we can get it, but it relies upon politicians being courageous to correctly diagnose the nature of the issue, the underlying problem, and collectively share responsibility. The global refugee regime is at a crossroads. The Syrian crisis will get worse. It is an exodus in the making. Unless we take this seriously, we'll be far worse off in future than we will be if we proportionately share global responsibility to address these underlying causes. There are only, and I say only, 16 million refugees around the world. The population of the planet is 7 billion. It surely can't be that much to expect politicians to be open, honest, and courageous about addressing the crisis of displacement around the world and ensuring people in desperate need have access to the right to seek asylum and, where necessary, our protection, including in Europe.
Thanks for that, Alex. That was really, really good. I was saying at the beginning, this probably won't end up being a debate because most people here are going to agree with each other, unless, have we got anybody from UKIP in the house? The only way we'll get a debate going. Thank you, that was great. Next, I'm going to welcome Gonzalo Fanjul, a journalist and economist, head of research for the Por Causa Foundation in Madrid. Gonzalo, we've heard from Alex about the refugee crisis, but many of those losing their lives, we know, they're economic migrants seeking jobs in Europe. And, you know, a lot of these, we've said before, the cream of their society. They're the person chosen by their village, the strongest, the most intelligent to represent their local community, to come across to Europe and have a go at earning some money. But just give us an idea of where they're coming from, why they're resorting to these extreme measures, and what hope is there for those that finally make it. Can they really integrate into European society?
Right. Thank you, Paul. Well, first of all, let me say that I think it's very difficult just to classify rigidly these flows because, as Alexander said, these are very much mixed flows. And while they have very diverse reasons to leave, when it comes to their destination points, they all have these aspirations to security and progress that make them somehow economic immigrants of different shapes, no? But this distinction is critical when it comes to the responsibility of destination countries in terms of their obligations, of their legal obligations, no? As it has been explained. And the first thing that I'd like to say is that I find that pretty troubling, because when you go to places like Mali or Mauritania, where I had the chance to visit, and you find, for instance, a woman that is escaping from religious persecution in northern Mali, and rightly deserves protection by the European Union, for instance, when she comes to our shores. And you compare that with her very cousin that lives across the border in Mauritania, that is escaping, trying to avoid the death of her son before he or she is 5, and has any reason to be protected but different reasons to be protected. We simply ignore that. And a country like Spain is subcontracting Morocco or Algeria just to put these people in the desert and leave them die in what in practical terms constitutes, in my view, a very basic violation of human rights. No? So the first point is that I think that there is this ethical strabismus that is very troubling, and I hope that this is one of the issues that we can advance due to this debate. No? The second point is that, in any case, what I think is that what we see in the Mediterranean, and it scares us so much and has created all this fuss, is really the tip of the iceberg. First of all, what we are seeing, even as economic migrants in the Mediterranean, although I completely agree that the bulk of what we are seeing right now is really flows of refugees and asylum seekers, but when it comes to economic migration, what we see in the Mediterranean is really a tiny part of the African immigration. And the African immigration in itself is a tiny part of what is happening in the global migration flows. Because for each African that is migrating, you have 12 Latin Americans that have been able to migrate, or you have 18 Asians that have been able to migrate. Simply because, not because the Africans do not want to migrate less than the rest, but it's very expensive to migrate. And you need money, and you need capacities. And the bulk of the Africans are not yet to the point where they have the capacity to migrate to the global north. No? And in that regard, I think that the idea that increasing aid to stop people at origin, as I think that Marta will expand, I think is simply, it's infantile. And the fact that men in the development sector are falling in that trap, I think it's not. Now. When we have to respond to your question about what they can expect when they come, well, in my view, what they can expect is a massive paradox. Migration is probably the single most important factor of development as an individual factor of development, and certainly of income convergence globally. It is one of the most important leverages for the as Marta will expand, but still it happens in the context of what I believe to be the most dysfunctional institutional and legal system that you can look into. It's a completely atomized. It's looked from a completely unilateral perspective from the countries of destination. And I think that, as Kevin said, operates against the very interest not just of the migrants and their countries of origin, but also of the destination countries themselves. And in a process that I think this is one of the main points in the European Union, is fragmented, and there is an institutional vacuum, except when it comes to the very control of the border. No, so in my view. The fact that NGOs, I worked for almost 15 years in Oxfam in the research area, and I am in open campaign in Oxfam, Save the Children, whoever wants to be bored by what I want to say, I am in open campaign to try to bring them back, to bring them to this debate on migration, because I think that it is really obscene that large development NGOs are not actively involved in this debate. No. And in my view, the combination of the political radioactiveness of these debates, as we are seeing now in electoral debates, not just in the UK but in many other countries, together with the lack of a real campaigning force from the side of those that could really make that case, I think that this is a recipe for disaster, and this is the reason why this system has not moved for decades now. No, so I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you for that. It's interesting. I used to, because I've done the migration route, obviously not migrating myself, filming the people doing it from both East and West Africa, and across into Libya, and then across into the Med. And if you say to people, particularly I found well, Ghanaians particularly, you'd say, what do you expect to find when you get to Europe? If you ever got to the UK, how do you think people would treat you? And I remember one guy saying to me, Mr. Paul, they will hug me, they will embrace me, they will be so pleased to see me. And I said, I'm not sure they will, you know. I'm not sure they will. And he just couldn't see it. And he said, when I said maybe, you know, I'm a little bit sceptical, he said, yeah, well, the thing is we have a very strong relationship because we're kind of part of your country. And he knew there'd been some link historically, but he didn't quite know how it had unravelled well, since the colonialists moved out. And it was a real shame that he, you know, the mismatch between what he expected and what would actually happen had he ever got to the UK. And I thought that was quite remarkable, really. We've got two more panellists. We've got Gonzalo Olosa, who's the UK representative of the UN Refugee Agency. Thanks very much for coming. And he's going to look more at sort of what happens once refugees make it to the UK. You know, we see in the newspapers a lot, obviously, that we think there's a great crisis in the UK. We see the tabloids would have us think that we're taking more refugees here than anywhere else. And, of course, we all know that that is very much not the case. So the UK's seen no increase in the number of refugees resettled here, has it, for some considerable period of time? Why is there such a disparity across Europe about how many refugees we take? And I know we're going to split this into two. There's the spontaneous arrivals, how few of those we take, when they come, how we treat them. But the resettlement programme, really. How few of the resettlement programme we really take, and how, if you could also potentially address the way that some of the politicians pretend that we're actually doing more than our fair share.
Thank you. Well, maybe I'll just take a step back. I mean, obviously, I second the points made by Alex on the refugee side. Obviously, I'll try not to repeat them. I mean, I will just make a few points. First, of course, that this indeed is not just an economic migrant crisis, but a refugee crisis. The solution to that refugee crisis, of course, doesn't lie primarily on tackling the smuggling. It relies on tackling the root causes of that refugee crisis, and that means the war in Syria, that means the mass human rights violations in Eritrea, etc., etc. And until those problems are not tackled, and of course the West and the European Union and the US, they all have a play. They can all have a positive influence in trying to address those root causes. Because while those push factors go on, people will continue to cross. The second point that I think I'll make, which gets lost often in this debate, and we've seen it, I mean, mentioned very scarcely in the news, in the media, in the past few days, is, I mean, one would get the impression when you look at these boats that, of course, the refugee crisis is in Europe. No, the refugee crisis actually is in the region. And I think Alex mentioned the Syrian example. 4 million Syrians have crossed into neighboring countries. So the regions of origin, if I can call them that, are doing, I mean, much more than the West is doing. They're doing much. I mean, they're doing much more than Europe, than the US, than Canada, etc. The problem, of course, is that they now are having major problems coping with those huge numbers. So, for example, for a Syrian who finds himself in the region and cannot find international protection there no longer in Lebanon or Jordan, and wants to make it to Europe because he believes or she believes that there they will be able to find the international protection they need. What are the avenues for him or her to come to Europe legally? Well, I mean, negligible. You mentioned the resettlement program. That, of course, is an avenue, for example, for Syrians, but not only, because resettlement also, of course, is directed at other case laws. But let's take the Syrians. There are 4 million in the region. We estimate that about 10% of those 4 million would fall within the criteria of the vulnerability criteria to benefit from resettlement. So that would be about 400,000 as the numbers stand now. However, we have adopted a cautious incremental approach, and for the time being we've just asked for 130,000 places. Well, we haven't even got that. In fact, we've only at the moment, if I'm not mistaken, the most recent figure in terms of pledges is about 80,000. So that program, which is already quite modest, we haven't got the result that we want. So it's only a very, very small number who, for example, could come to Europe through that formal, safe, official channel. So what other options they have? Well, very, very limited. And that's why they get in these very dangerous boats, because they have very few other possibilities. Once they arrive here, there are also, as you mentioned, I mean, there's a problem in the dynamic of how those asylum seekers who arrive in Europe are distributed within Europe. Again, to give you the example of the Syrians, there's I think 222,000 Syrians who, since the war started, I think since very early 2011, who've arrived here and sought asylum. Well, more than half of those 222,000 have sought asylum just in 2 countries, in Germany and Sweden. So some of those 2 countries are, feeling, of course, that they are carrying more than their fair share in terms of Syrians. So that is a major problem.
Do we take our fair share?
Well, for example, I mean, since early 2011, I believe it's just under 7,000 Syrians who have arrived here and sought asylum, while I mean in Sweden it's almost 55,000, and in Germany almost 60,000. So you see that there is a great disparity, and somehow that issue also needs to be tackled as part of the response to the problem.
When we see those pictures on the television, I mean, I find that people just, their response to them is, look at all these migrants coming our way. And actually, as we know, very, very few, and I mean, of all the people I've spoken to on those routes, when you say, where do you want to get to, very, very few say the UK. Most of them say Europe, but some of them think Europe's a country anyway, and they just mean to get to safety. And when you say, but why? Why Europe? Why not a particular country? They'll just say, we just want peace. And I found they meant peace with a small p, not with a capital P. They just wanted pleasantness from other people. They wanted to be able to walk down the street without having, dirt all over the place and kids sleeping on the street. They wanted just something that would give them some peace of mind, some tranquility, if you like. But that idea that we always think that all these people are coming our way, I mean, let's bear in mind that, of course, if they were able to melt away through Italy or Spain or wherever they've arrived, the idea that they can then get across the English Channel, I mean, it's incredibly difficult. And I'm sure you found the same. The people who tend to be waiting in Calais to come across, very small groups, I mean, Eritreans, quite a lot of those who feel as though they might have connections with family members already in the UK. But I mean, to get across the English Channel, very few squeeze through to the final stage, don't they, if that's what they desired in the first place. Right, we've got one more person who's Marta Foresti, who's ODI's Director of Governance, Security and Livelihoods. And he's going to talk about possibly the most tricky aspect, which is that, we all say, surely this is to do with poverty in Africa. If we can develop Africa, if we send lots of aid there and, we develop some of the infrastructure there, people won't want to come here. It's a long-term plan, but surely that's the way of resolving it. Is that the way of resolving it in a word?
Let me try 2 answers, see the ones you prefer. The first answer is that, of course, this is a terribly complex problem, and that the relationship between development and migration is one that deserves a lot more attention, is not a one-way street, and a lot more research is needed to understand how it works. The second answer is no.
Thanks.
And it is no, and there is
But
actually...
it's, sorry to butt in, but it's meant by well-meaning people, isn't it? They just say, surely that's the way, in the long run, that's the way. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. It's just a little naive, you would say.
It's wrong. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having perceptions about how things work. But what is very interesting about this very topic is that the evidence is pretty compelling in relation to what is the relation between development and migration. So those of you might have seen recent work by Michael Clemens at CGD that sort of surveyed the literature, the economic literature, and finds that there is no evidence as a country gets richer as migration decreases. If anything, the opposite may well be true, that as there is higher rates of migrations as countries do develop. And I think Eritrea has been mentioned here a few times. Some of you might have seen the recent article by Michaela Wrong in Foreign Policy, where she makes the point that people cannot live of MDGs alone, and uses Eritrea as an example where some of the MDGs indicators are doing very, relatively well, and yet people are fleeing because of aspiration, are fleeing because they search political freedoms. Sorry, I'm not sure about that. We will, but. Do you mean historically? Should we?
Well, should we come? I'm going to be really impolite and say, shall we come to that question when she's just finished this?
Yes.
Would you mind? I will do. Yeah.
I don't think is the. I think actually I'm making the same point, but let's get to that in a minute. So my proposition is that it is not true that aid and development reduces migration, and that trying to use development as a way to limit migration will be barking on the wrong tree. Now, let me see if I can convince you all that far from being a politically incendiary, or what did you say? Toxic, no, yeah. Radioactive
better.
Proposition in the current political climate, this is actually an opportunity in the waiting, and that this is something that us in the development community should do something about. The first reasons why I would like to convince you that's the case, because as I mentioned, this is an area where the evidence is in fact compelling and pointing in the same direction. Our policymakers love evidence-based policies. If there is an area where there is something to be done based on evidence, this could be one. And it's not just the well-known and well-rehearsed sort of evidence around the economic benefits that migrants have in the economies around the world. It is also historical evidence. I was going to come into that point. I come from a country, Italy, where the wealth of the north was made by the migrants from the south. And I'm here as an economic migrant because of my aspiration in my life. So I think we all are aware of the experience of the positive aspects of migration and how it relates to development. The third is another fascinating body of evidence that is emerging that Kevin and others have made reference to, that Alex's colleagues in Oxford work on, around what drives and motivates people to come. People come and will continue to come. There is very little that will change that motivation. There is very little that perceptions about risk will do. I think there are quite striking figures about the level of risks and that people are prepared to take to improve their lives. So we have the evidence. We have a bit of work to do to work on a narrative, and I think it would be good to come back to this point during the discussion. The second proposition I've got for you is that one of the reasons why this should be embraced and not refused because of its political difficulties, that actually when it comes to politics, this is actually a political imperative. I mean, it may not seem that way for policymakers, for politicians standing in the elections next week. That's probably a bit too late. But any politicians in the making that is looking at leadership in a period of 7-10 years' time will have to get their heads around the fact that this phenomenon is not going to change, that these people will continue to come, and the shift in the conversations to managing the phenomenon and making the most of it rather than trying to carry on with border control as the political imperative might be a better option. So my proposition is that we should go out and look for them, that there are politicians out there that might actually want to work on this rather than run a mile like we often assume. So given that I think that there are these parameters that will potentially provide for a different approach to this, for actually embracing migration as part of development policies, let me lay out 5-point plans on how to go about it. The first is what Alex said. We need to deal with the refugee crisis, and as Alex demonstrated, this can be done. And we just need to get on with it. The point is there are difficulties around it, but the world can take it. Rich economies can do it, have to take it. There is an international law. We need to do it. We then need to not make a mistake, which is something that we always say in development, we better learn to, to recognize and, from our mistakes and do something about it. We should not make the mistake that this is a crisis in the Mediterranean that, will be resolved and is just an humanitarian affairs. This is something that will continue because some of the conflicts that we see in Libya and elsewhere, in Syria and elsewhere are likely to erupt elsewhere because there are natural disasters happening all the time. So let's make sure that we make that connection between the refugee crisis, the humanitarian imperatives, and the long-term needs, and the fact that there will continue to be economic migration, and the fact that there is a connection between this and the debates that are happening in Europe, in this country and elsewhere about migration. Let's then embrace, that's point 3, that development is migration, not something that, the development stops migration, but that there is something inherent in mobility and people moving that connects and is interconnected with development. And as I said, this is where we get the evidence out and the academics and the numbers that support our point. Then we move on to a policy agenda, and the policy agenda has to be about labour mobility. And in fact, there is an opportunity maybe not lost yet on the SDGs. SDGs have a very vague and I think weak, others are more optimistic, but it has some language around making labour mobility one of the key goals. Colleagues at CGD have actually published some ideas about what kind of indicators we could use to make it a bit better. So there is a policy agenda in the waiting, and there is something to be done about facilitating labour mobility and making the most of it. The fourth point is our campaigners' friends, which of course are a key ingredient in any development enterprise and policies. We have in this country a phenomenally powerful set of NGOs and campaigners who have advocated and managed to get something like 0% into law. Some will have different views about how good of an idea that was, but they demonstrated that they can achieve a lot. Let's get them behind, as Gonzalo said, migration work. And then fifth, and perhaps most important of all, and the real challenge for all of us, including as analysts and researchers who work on these issues, let's not make this about aid from day one. Let's acknowledge that sending aid wherever is not the point here. That is another critical example where aid can actually do more harm than good in and of itself, if not managed properly. So let's make this from the beginning a whole of government policy. So let's take development and migration as part of a proper beyond aid plan where, from the beginning, policymakers reach out to government departments from across government to think of a joint plan, which is all about shifting the debate here as much as it is addressing the phenomena over there. So if I've convinced you, I'm halfway through an effective...
I think there'll be some questions about that at the end, because it's, some good phrases. Development is migration is a great phrase, but you can't imagine any politician in the UK coming out with that before an election. It's anyway.
I'm ready for the debate.
Just before we take questions, I'm just going to tell you a very quick story, because part of the reason I'm here is to try and sort of bring it back to the human element on the ground. And when I was doing the journey with some of these migrants, there was a group who very, very narrowly survived, and their boat had capsized, and they ended up spending a long time hanging on to a tuna fishing net in the middle of the Mediterranean. I think there were 27 of them in all. And when they were describing the journey to me later, I mean, it's just to show you the sort of innocence of the journey. First of all, none of them knew how far they were going. One of them had been told that if they carried on going in the same direction, they would be sailing down the Thames in the morning. It's in the middle of the Mediterranean. But when their boat started sinking, they said, we very quickly started throwing things into the water. We could see that we were going to drown. None of us could swim. So we started throwing. So I said, what did you throw? What did you throw? Thinking it might have been each other or something. And the guy said, the first thing we found was something very, very big and very heavy. And we threw it in, and I said, and what was it? And he said, it was like a clock. But it didn't have numbers on it. It had letters. So it had an N at the top and an S. So the first thing they threw overboard was the compass. None of them knew what the compass was and what it was for, and the fact that that might have helped them survive. And the following year, we traced some of these guys back to the village they'd first left. And this village in Ghana supplies an enormous number of people every year onto the migration route. They go up through Burkina Faso, Niger, across into Libya, and then across the Mediterranean. And I'm going to show you a clip, it's just to give you an idea of on the ground when you talk to people. It just shows you, first of all, how many of the young men between, say, 17, 25 and 30, something like that, would want to make the journey to Europe. How many of them had friends who died trying? And the leader of the village, if you like, who's an imam, and just to hear what he says and the advice that he gives to people. because it might surprise you. So we'll just see that. Musa is an intelligent, thoughtful man who speaks 6 languages and has travelled widely, more widely than people here know. Today, he tells them to pray for those attempting the journey. And whilst Justice tried to dissuade them, Musa has his own story and offers only encouragement. Justice himself used to worship here, and around 30 others from this congregation have followed the same route. Many of them have died. How do you feel about that? Because you've encouraged them to have a go.
Yeah, it's like a war. Either you win or lose. It's like a gamble.
What's the war? What is the war, though? Who are you fighting?
Yes, we are fighting poverty and sickness. It is not easy. It's expensive here to do some medication, even some drugs.
And what do you say to the families of those who've died trying?
We just console them. They should forget about it and forge ahead.
Musa has a secret that only his family know. Back in 1995, he and 3 friends attempted the same journey to Europe as Justice Amin. When they reached the Mediterranean, 53 of them crammed into a boat. There were only 5 life jackets. A storm blew up. And how many people survived and how many died?
Only 5, then rest
5 survived. All the rest died.
died.
You were one of the lucky ones.
Of course, I'm one of the lucky ones.
And there's no shortage of others willing to try their luck. A teenager who plans to leave for Europe soon, Salou. Mahmoud, who stowed away in a ship to Greece, but was caught and returned home. Dured, who made it to Libya, the halfway point. Nearby, one of the most respected men in town, Al-Hajj Baki. A son of his drowned trying to cross the Mediterranean. Then there's Yahia. He's attempted the crossing to Europe 3 times. Where did you want to go in Europe? Because I see you're wearing an England shirt.
Yes, definitely. You've got permits. That maybe England or Germany. That's the 2 places I like. You've got permits. If I'm able to make it, I'll go there.
Ghana is a major contributor to the 50,000 migrants who try to reach Europe each year. How are these men seen by the rest of the community?
Oh, they describe them as a heroes. Somebody like Justice, we call him a hero now.
We left the men of Efia Kuma making their plans. Ahead lay the journey to Libya. For some, the gateway to prosperity in Europe. For others, an escape from persecution, war, and hunger. There you go. I think it's quite a revealing insight into what they do in some of the villages back there and the way that they will celebrate one individual who, as I was saying earlier, might be the strongest and the most able and send him on his way. Right, so we are going to open it to questions. And I might take sort of 2 or 3 at the same time, but you need to, if you don't mind, say where you're from. Well, 5 at the same time, I'm being told. Just say where you're from and a bit about your background very briefly.